I'm Rajdeep,
And I'm Ethan Quinones.
and this is Between Past and Future. Today's episode is Appropriation versus Appreciation. We're going to be taking a look at the problem with Apu, Speedy Gonzalez, and BoJack Horseman, as well as a review roundup. Go ahead and run us down with the headlines, Ethan.
So this episode is about the larger context of cancel culture. So this list is not people who've been canceled or shows that have been taken off the air necessarily, but just a quick list of things that have been affected by it. And I'll go into detail on some of them, and some of them are more clear. But so Cops, the TV show, seems pretty clear why that might be getting canceled right now. Brooklyn Nine-Nine wasn't canceled, but they decided to not release 4 episodes that were in the works or had been already set to release. And they're going to be rethinking their show going forward because of the overall positive light of how they portray cops. Gone with the Wind, over positive and false portrayals of slaves and pre-Civil War conditions. Splash Mountain, based off of very racist Disney films.
Oh yeah, that's one of their most racist movies.
Uncle Ben, the Rice spokesperson character. Paw Patrol, which portrays police in a positive light for children. And Jemima, the maple syrup character. The Dixie Chicks are changing their name to remove the Dixie. There's going to be the Chicks. Lady Antebellum is going to be going by Lady A from now on. J.K. Rowling ran afoul of cancel culture because of a tweet, and then later a 3,000 word, 2,000 word statement clarifying her position on trans issues. The Poetry Foundation had a reckoning where 1,800 people signed a letter saying they needed to be more inclusive. James Bennett, an editor from the New York Times, resigned after controversy where they published a Tim Cotton op-ed about the protests. Bon Appetit, Adam Rappaport, he came under fire from, I think it was, he was engaging in black or brown face related to Puerto Rican culture and was dismissive of other cultures with relation to food. The Vogue editor had an issue related to race issues. CrossFit CEO tweeting about George Floyd. Philadelphia Inquirer had an issue related to a headline that said "Buildings Matter." Was it "Buildings Matter" or "Buildings Matter" too? The Dukes of Hazzard might be canceled because of the Confederate flag on the car and the overall kind of old boys mentality of the show. Vanderpump Rules. Apparently, there's a bunch of racist accusation amongst the cast, and a Gandhi statue in England is being talked about being taken down due to his views about blacks that he had in South Africa as a young man. So that's kind of the background. There's been a whole lot of...
and Sacramento Kings announcer Grant Napier got it thrown in the local story.
Yeah, he was... so what happened? Somebody asked him if he thought Black Lives Matter. And
yeah, Marcus DeCousin asked him about what's going on, and he tweeted out in kind of an obnoxious manner, "This is what I think. All lives matter," with a capital, all caps. Yeah, the team has had various basketball NBA players and teammates have had problems with Grant Napier for years, actually.
Well, yeah, there's this larger trend of reckoning coming, and it's sometimes like somebody, I can't remember his full name. I think his last name is Sawyer, first name is Sawyer. He played a character on The Flash. It's like Elastic Man or Plastic Man, something like that. He had tweets come up from 2014 to 2015 that I think had been deleted by the time they came up. Like an image just came up from them, and he got fired too. And some of these people aren't fired. Like, they haven't said Paw Patrol is canceled. It's being talked about. Brooklyn Nine-Nine is not being canceled. Gone with the Wind is actually back already with the warning label, I believe. So it's not that things are being canceled, but things that have some sort of incorrect or supposedly incorrect view on race or ethnicity are being looked at very harshly. So that's why we decided to look specifically at cartoons. And there's this idea with Apu and Diane Nguyen from
BoJack Horseman.
Yeah, that there needs to be a accuracy of the voice actor's race and the character's race. Branch out into some less related topics. Look at Apu and Speedy Gonzalez very specifically for different versions of how people reacted to these characters, how some were more or less accurate, and hopefully it'll be a...
And we're going to start with Apu.
Yep, so we'll be right back after this break.
I'm sorry.
Self-destruct sequence
Does not
activated.
compute. Absolutely excellent. Warning, warning. What the fuck? Get back to work, you slacker.
I just watched The Problem with Apu. It was directed by stand-up comedian Hari Kondabolu. It's a Telugu name. I don't speak Telugu, so I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Yeah, we're gonna talk about sort of the issues that come up around the movie, The Problem with Apu, because there's been in the media recently, there's been a lot of talk about how people should only be portraying characters of their same race or ethnicity. And that's one of the main arguments against Apu in this documentary. I got to be honest, when I first came across this documentary, my dad and I found out about it at the same time, and my dad immediately had an adverse reaction to it. He thought it was kind of a nonsense argument about someone being too sensitive. Hari addresses this criticism from almost at the beginning of the movie. But yeah, we're going to talk about why Apu is actually a bit more complicated than the documentary makes it out to be, and the different effects or the different ways of which Apu is perceived. Because I don't have I don't have almost any problem with Apu, at least not in the same way that Hari does. So does that sound good, Ethan?
Yeah, and I think throughout it we'll address the different Hari's different and other actors' different problems, because there is some contradiction. It isn't like he's saying all Indian people think this. Various people say they're more or less offended by him, and there's like maybe 5 or 6 different angles that they're undermining the character. So it's not even just because Hank Azaria is white.
Right.
There's also the issue of he's not doing a specific Indian accent. There's no real thing it's based off of. It's actually based off of a different stereotype, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's probably a good place to start, because I do think that that is one of the most valid criticisms about Hank Azaria's portrayal of Apu, is that it's not a specific regional accent. And I think one of the reasons that's so important, especially as it relates to The Simpsons, is because of the character of Willie, the groundskeeper, Scottish man. And there's actually his accent fluctuates a little bit in the early seasons, and people in Scotland took notice, and there is a, let's see, not a rivalry, but there's I think it's Aberdeen and Glasgow. Both cities tried to claim that Willie has a accent that is more closely related to their specific region, and it created a sense of ownership over the character. And they would make digs at each other and be like, no, Willie is ours, that sort of thing. So Hank Azaria, with the Apu character, instead of doing this broad accent that's not really from anywhere in India.
What does Sakina Joffrey, she brings this point up about how there's a specific accent you're required to do when you play this character. That's like, what did she call it? It's like petunking, something like that.
Something like that, yeah. I never heard the term before watching this movie.
But yeah, it is, and it's specifically supposed to be almost like a mockery in like a minstrel way. So minstrelry isn't a representation of blackness; it's a mocking, and this almost to the white audience is supposed to sound like over dramatized. But then it brings up the point where we looked into, because I was only aware of Sakina Joffrey from the show House of Cards, where she plays Linda Vasquez. And looking back at it now, knowing that she's not Hispanic, the voice she did kind of sounded to me like, looking back, like a measured voice of someone who specifically speaks English, to they learned to speak English very well, like went to college, educated accent. I don't know if this character is supposed to be born in America or born elsewhere. I don't remember if that's mentioned, but a lot of times, I met some people from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic who speak English better than any Americans I know, because they specifically practiced and learned it. So in that case, if she's putting on a voice, so to speak, to embody Linda Vasquez and try to portray accurately a Hispanic woman who maybe grew up with an accent or grew up with parents with an accent, then she's kind of embodying, she's not representing her own race.
Right, which is one of the big problems that's going on. It's specific problem that's mentioned in The Problem with Apu, but it's a bigger problem that's sort of running through the cancel culture stuff that's going on right now. So I think one more thing or another thing that we should talk about is this idea that one of the big problems with Apu's the way Apu is portrayed is that he was one dimensional, and that was a particular problem in the early 90s because there wasn't any other representation of Indian people on television or in media. And I can understand the pain and frustration that might have caused people. This was before my time. I've never. There's always been some form of Indian person on television since I was a kid. I was born in '95. Um, I mean, not great representation, but still, they're there. Um, and I think we need to look at this idea from like the perspective, like this notion of the center and the margin. I think those are really important ideas that we lose sight of. Check out Jonathan Peugeot. He's got a YouTube channel. He talks about the center and the margin. Wendell Berry. He's got a great essay on the issue of the center and the margin. And
so center and margin, you mean like there's some people who are in the center of the cultural landscape. So let's say
yes.
in 1960, that's all going to be white. Everything's centered around white people.
Right.
And then as we move forward, suddenly in 1989, 1990, Southeast Asian people are moving in from the margins, and Apu is the first one who's in the center mainstream television show that everyone knows about.
Right. And like the first representation is always going to be some form of caricature because it is someone, they've just sort of arrived on the scene. And I think a really good way to think about it is when you think about medieval maps. Google some pictures of medieval maps. They're not complete, right? They didn't know about the whole world. And on the margins of things or in the ocean, it will say something like "Here be dragons," and they have depictions of these sort of monstrous creatures, these half dog, half human people, maybe like a person with like an eyeball in their chest. And the initial contact with the foreigner is always a caricature because you don't know them. How can you make an accurate representation if you don't actually know?
Especially,
Huh?
and especially in an ancient medieval world where
Right.
you don't travel very much. You live and die within 5 miles of your house. So the first time you meet someone who speaks Arabic, it's so foreign to you. You're not going to have any idea what's going on. You might think their sorcerer is trying to cast a spell on you.
Yeah, that's very true.
You've never heard, imagine that you've never heard a foreign language before.
I have a story from my AP government teacher in high school, Mr. Ivanov. He's from the Ukraine, born and raised there, and he remembers the first time he saw a black person because there's no black people living in the Ukraine, and for some reason there was one in his town that day. He lived in a smaller town, so he wasn't even in the metropolitan area as far as I know. And him and his best friend just followed him around all day because they were like, "What?" They were fascinated. They had never even conceived of the idea that a person could be that color.
Like when Whoopi Goldberg is talking in the
movie. Yeah.
Yeah, about this advertisement where these little white kids, and they're looking at a small black child saying, "Does he taste like chocolate?" And
Right.
she's like, "Well, if you think about it from an ignorant person, we do kind of look like chocolate." And she jokes about it, like you might even be able to work it to your advantage, like people trying to lick you to see if it tastes like chocolate. But and she has this whole museum, and it's like to her when she looks at these racist artifacts, she's not filled with horror. It's like they're ignorant people. Of course, they're going to think stupid things. And like if you're ignorant largely of what Indian and Southeast Asian people are like, what you come up with and what makes Americans laugh is kind of going to be ignorant and malformed. And then over time, it would become like because they're trying to almost in a way represent all Indian Southeast Asian people through this Apu character, or at least accidentally doing that. And so of course it's going to be completely false because there's like 15 different languages, 8 different religions. It's so completely diverse. One character can't possibly do that.
Oh yeah, the amount of diversity within India itself.
Yeah,
It's like if Europe was one country. There's that much diversity in India. People don't realize that, but that is the case.
I read some statistic where there's like over 25 languages with 1 million people speaking them in India, and then let alone if you drop that number down to like 20, 30,000 people who speak them, there's like, I don't know the exact number.
Oh, India has dozens and dozens of official languages.
Yeah. And that's also decreased over time too.
Yeah, as things homogenize, and as you, this is an India specific thing. As like India is not the idea of an Indian nation is only as old as 1947. Before that, there was the Indian subcontinent, and there was this sort of this identity that was unified under sort of this Hindu pantheon. But the idea of being even Indian is a very modern construction.
But then also to get back on track with the Apu movie.
Yeah.
So Apu also he's not a stereotype of Hari, right? Or even Kalpen or Aziz. He is a stereotype of their parents. So that's
right.
Something that's really upsetting to these people.
Yes, it is something that's really upsetting. And just doing a quick glance at all these people's Wikipedia pages, one of the things that I noticed is a lot of their parents were very highly educated people. Let's see. Hari's parents, Hari's dad, I believe, his mother was a doctor in India. And both of his parents became the heads of New York area medical labs. So the idea that Apu is a representation of your dad when your dad works at a medical lab and he's in charge of it, I could see how that's very frustrating. Another character or another person who was interviewed in the documentary who was actually on The Simpsons later, Utkarsh Abudkar, but his parents were the head scientists of the NIH in Baltimore. And it's very different when you see Apu as a representation of your parent, and your parent is this very educated person who's working in, I don't know, the STEM field or whatever field, versus like I have several family members who own and run convenience stores and work in them every day. So it's a different thing. And you might think that, like, doesn't that make Apu more offensive to you? It's like, no, because it's true to life. It's true to my experience. Like, that is what Indian people do. They run convenience stores. Obviously, they do more than that. Like, my parents don't run a convenience store, but several of my very close relatives own and run convenience stores.
Like where I was growing up, there weren't too many. There weren't a lot of Indian people who had families and lived in Troy, but there's a huge school, RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. It's one of the best like engineering schools in the world, and there's a large number of Asian students, Chinese and Indian students, and all over Southeast, East Asia, etc. But there are a lot of corner stores with Indian owners and operators, people behind the counter who have accents. And then, but you also see all of these students who are, a lot of them are wealthy. If the RPI is a very expensive school, or they're like, very hardworking, like very studious. So you're exposed to both aspects, like people who become doctors or lawyers. And in the place we went to go to the doctor, ironically, was Albany Medical Center. And it was like the Albany pediatric thing. So this was like not a bad hospital, but like dealt with poor patients basically, and so most of the doctors were of color. Our doctor growing up in town in Bristol was black, and there's a lot of Indian doctors there. So it was you'd see both of them. And for a while it didn't really make sense until I read this article talking about how when there are these jobs that came up where you could pay a certain amount of money to acquire a gas station or a hotel, for example, the people who snapped up the opportunity happened to be from Southeast Asia. They were
South Asia.
South Asia?
Yeah, Southeast Asia is like Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia.
Okay. So South Asia, like particular, I had a group of people who were willing to travel very far away from wherever they were from and not live necessarily near anyone like them in order to get this opportunity. So then, that makes more sense once you learn that, like, because as a kid, you're like, what's going on? Why do so many Indian people work at convenience stores? Why does this stereotype exist, and why do I sometimes see it in life? But if you grew up in a town that only had one Indian family and they happen to work at the convenience store, your idea of Apu would be, might be more stereotypical because you're not exposed to, you don't have an Indian doctor, or you don't have an Indian lawyer, or even like there's a guy who runs a Indian restaurant instead of the convenience store.
Right, and I think that the point that they bring up, like, representation should improve over time. as the new culture, the new people assimilate into the American culture or just adapt to it, right? As we start participating in more avenues of American life, of course, representation is going to change, and that is a good thing. Um, we just want to complicate sort of this the view that's presented and the problem with Apu because there are some problems, but um, there's really good things that Apu did. There's a few particular episodes like when Lisa becomes a vegetarian. She has a very difficult time. She has this ethical crisis about she cannot eat animals anymore. She finds it a horrible, horrible thing. But then everyone around her is eating meat, and she feels this intense pressure to the point where she breaks and she runs to the quickie mart and she eats a hot dog there. And uh, she goes, I did it. I ate meat finally. And Apu said, what are you talking about? There's no meat in that hot dog. I made the switch to tofu dogs, and all the people of Springfield are so dumb. They didn't recognize the difference. And Apu shows Lisa how to be a vegetarian. And he, he shows a person how to live, that it is possible to live in a manner that doesn't coincide with the dominant culture or ideology of your neighbors. Apu is
Yeah.
a Hindu, and he doesn't give into the like. There's no episode where he converts to Christianity. He keeps his identity and who he was intact, and there's a very powerful lesson in that.
Yeah, and I think kind of what we ended up talking about after we both watched the documentary was some of it seems to be a problem almost with Hank Azaria, where it's
Yeah,
understandable that he starts out doing, this caricature accent, but like a rule I'd be okay with rather than you have to be of a certain race to portray that race, especially in a cartoon. Um, I think the cartoon is different from live action very much so, actually, but if he did more research and said, all right, I've been doing this character for a couple of years, and some people, like, I think you should be aware, yeah, some people are going to be offended by me doing such a stereotype. Instead of abandoning it or saying, I'm going to put out a casting call for somebody Indian, pick a specific region of India where, a lot of people who run convenience stores might actually be coming from, or
right.
the person who's in your neighborhood. Hey, what part of India are you from? Because I do this character and I want it to be more accurate. Don't
Right,
get
like
mad at him, but
he does
stop being
bring
there.
up in the documentary they get an excerpt from an interview of Hank, and he says that he based the accent off of the guy who worked at the local convenience store that he went to. And he could have spent some time talking to that man and getting a better understanding of who he was and made Apu more of a fleshed out character based off of that particular man's experience.
And it seemed almost like so the gripe he had with the man was that he would open his Gatorade and drink it in line, and the guy would be like, "No, no, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
You pay for it." It's like, yeah, a lot of people do that, but if one particular store owner has a gripe with it, don't do it. It's their store.
Right.
Um, so I was listening to Hank Azaria tell this story, and I'm like hoping it's not going to be like, oh, some offensive thing, and it is. I think that specific story is the biggest. Case against Apu is that it's based off of a store owner he had a gripe on partly, and the
Right.
store owner's gripe was, I think he was right. If they came to like civil court and he said, it's a lawsuit for $5, I want to make a point, I would definitely side with the store owner and say, Hank Azaria, from now on, don't drink your Gatorade until after you've paid for it. Because how do you know?
um,
Maybe you go up to the counter and your card is declined. Someone stole your
right.
money.
Bounce a check back in the 90s.
Yeah, but
I think we got one more point to talk about this, and we'll move on to Speedy Gonzalez. Um, and that is, I do have sympathy for people like Hari, Aziz, because they grew up. They were in the schoolyard when Simpsons became a phenomenon, right? I experienced it in a very different way. Simpsons and the way they did things had already been completely made a part of the American imaginary, I guess, imagination. And I could see it being really difficult that all of a sudden the kids who didn't have any idea of how to make fun of you, now they all have a way to make fun of you, right? And
yeah,
I think that
and they did
Simpsons. Oh, go
before.
ahead.
They did mention before the Indiana Jones and the monkey
Right,
breaking. So I think
and
Hari
that's
kind
pretty
of does
harsh.
this. Yeah, and there's not to get too far off track, but Cal Penn makes this claim where someone comes up and says, "Oh, now everyone's calling me Kumar after you made that movie," and he's like, "Well, at least it's not Apu." And in some sense, Apu is better than the
Indiana
brown
Jones.
white people eating monkey brains in Indiana Jones.
Yeah. I think this is something that you and I discussed, and I think the shows like Simpsons, South Park, Family Guy, they actually changed the way kids interact on the schoolyard. And I think both you and I, even my younger sister, we have a different experience of how we interact with race, and that is everyone makes fun of everybody's race, and we're all okay about it. It's a way of bonding.
It might also be more unique to like. So when I was a kid and someone was PC, this could be like a white woman who didn't like rap music because it had too many swear words, right? It
Right.
didn't necessarily mean someone who's a social justice warrior. So when you're a kid and you're watching South Park and they're all making these horrible jokes, your parents are saying, "Don't make these horrible jokes, that's offensive." And you and all the kids, when there's no parents around, are making these jokes to each other. So like on the
Right.
bus, going back and forth to soccer games, we'd sit in the back where the coach couldn't hear us and we'd all make fun of each other and say horrible things. So, because
But you
I also,
didn't mean it, right? Like
no,
there's a difference. Like I had an interaction with a kid on a bus. His name was Trevor. We were fun. We were bus buddies. We were bus chums. We would make fun of each other. We would talk trash. And he wrote in my yearbook. And this is post 9/11, right? So he wrote in my yearbook, "Oh, Raj, I love you, man. You're my favorite terrorist. JK, JK." My mom got really upset when she saw that. I don't know why she was reading my yearbook, especially the signatures, but that's what moms do. And I had to sit down and be like, "No, mom, it's okay. Leave it alone." She wanted to go to the school. She wanted to talk to the bus driver. She wanted to get school authorities involved in this. I was like, "No, mom, it's really okay." Like he calls me like a terrorist, and I say, "Oh, well, you're fat," or whatever. I like the specifics aren't important, but it wasn't about actually putting each other down. Um, it was a weird form of bonding.
and it kind of makes it okay. Like there is, especially if you're in a very diverse school, and like in my school system, each elementary school, the diversity ranged up and down. So there's one elementary school that was near the uh, RPI, the college, and so a lot of those kids actually, their parents were professors at RPI, but they didn't go to the public high school. A lot of them ended up going to private schools. I don't know the percentages exactly, but that school, for example, would have more diversity in terms of Asian kids and Middle Eastern kids, all different sorts of countries. But then the school 12 that was in downtown Troy was majority black and Hispanic. There's another school that was mostly white. My school was like pretty mixed between, it was like kind of in a cross between like there's some black kids, some Hispanic kids. One kid's parents were from RPI. A lot of kids were just, their parents lived there for years and years. Italian kids, Irish kids, etc. But there's always this unspoken kind of tension. You learn about racism and there's black kids in class. Not being able to talk about race doesn't solve the problem. So making fun
Right.
of each other and being like, "Oh, your ancestors were slave owners," because that's a horrible thing to be, and being like, "Oh, well, black people are criminals, or Hispanic people hot borders, or Muslim people are terrorists." Making fun of these stereotypes and it being okay to laugh about knocks them down in a way. But to the older generation, especially if you grew up and you were the only kid in school, that
Knocks down the stereotypes. I wanted to clarify that.
yeah, knocks down this like you're
Yeah,
not,
not the person, the stereotype.
yeah, you're making fun of, when you say these things, you're actually making fun of the racist who really believes them.
Right.
You're not really believing them. It's like acting. I'm playing the racist person and you're playing the racist
Exactly.
person and it's my race. And like, especially Muslim kids would make fun of each other for having different forms of Islam and from being from different countries. So my Algerian friend would make fun of someone from Sudan, and sometimes it would actually seem serious, and I'd hear them be like, "Wow, that sounds racist," or like pretty bad.
Yeah, it's
Um,
harsh.
yeah, but engaging in that sort of stuff, if you weren't allowed to laugh about it, and teachers a lot of times would, and older people, like if you were the only Indian kid in 1970, it seems like that was a lot harsher. Like people are getting beat up more. Like bullies were more of a thing. Where like you get your lunch money
Yeah,
stolen.
America was more violent from the 70s to the 90s than when we grew up.
Yeah, like from 2000 and after 9/11, there's this big explosion of racism and Islamophobia, right? But then there's also awareness among teachers who would never think to tell people not to be Islamophobic, are suddenly, so like in my school, uh, teachers would say like, you can't make fun of someone for being Muslim. That's
Right.
not okay. But before, without the onslaught of Islamophobia post 9/11, if you're the only Muslim kid in school, and then you grow up and have kids, and you see the same jokes being told, you're going to think, wow, this same culture of bullying is happening. But really, in your kids' generation, they're knocking down these stereotypes, and they're
Right,
repeating the
because of
jokes.
shows like South Park, Simpsons, and Family Guy, because they are knocking down. See, it's a weird thing, right? Like one generation, it might seem as they're propping up these stereotypes, but it's also when everyone's a stereotype, whether or not some stereotypes are depicted in a better way than right, like Willie versus Apu, right? There's that difference of being specific about the stereotype, but I do think that those shows actually had probably a better effect on how people relate to each other and relate to stereotypes. Like that's what a cartoon is for in some ways.
Like escapism, and
Yeah.
also I do like the fact that Hari said Apu made him in some sense who he is, and this comedian who made a documentary about Apu.
Right.
So
And
the
Hari
Family
loves
Guy
The
South
Simpsons.
Park, yeah, he loves it. So the Family Guy South Park, whatever, they're Family Guy and South Park and Simpsons. They were some of the first shows to have these characters on and make these jokes. So the next wave of shows, hopefully, will have a more accurate depiction of this. But at the same time, they did accomplish some good things, and they definitely, I think, made kids more able to joke about these things versus being like, you know, I don't want to bring this up. I don't want to be racist, so I'm just going to ignore race and pretend that kid isn't black.
Right.
Instead of, you both make fun of each other. Like, haha, you're going to get a sunburn, blah, blah, blah.
Right. And I think, yeah, that makes sense. I got one more point on this, and then we'll move on to the next thing. Um, this woman in the documentary talks about how Apu has to, because he's a stereotype, he has to have a lot of kids. Maybe, I mean, that's part of like a fertility treatment thing gone wrong within the show. And then another thing she points out is that Apu has an arranged marriage and how that's a stereotype. And yes, to some degree, like that's a bad, like it's a one-dimensional depiction of an Indian person. And I would say yes in one way of looking at it, but the other side of it is how many white people in the mid 90s knew what an arranged marriage was. I have a feeling it wasn't that many. And to be frank about it, everyone in my parents' generation had an arranged marriage. It was a common thing. Not so much in my generation, although few of the oldest people of my generation did have an arranged marriage. But it like stereotypes uh, do cut both ways. Simplistic it is a simplistic representation, but insofar as it gets more complicated, it actually brings in authentic aspects of the stereotypes culture.
And you kind of have to, like, if you have a Apu as a character, he's going to be a main character, he gets popular. And it's popular maybe for this racist thing, right, where white people like the accent. But when
Right.
you have episodes about Apu over time, you're going to have to flesh him out. And so, okay, what is his family life like? What is his uncle? What is his brother like? What are his parents like? Is he Brahmin or is he an untouchable? And
And he is a Brahmin.
yeah, and I think like honestly, the first time I ever really thought about arranged marriage or heard about it was through Pooh and the Simpsons. I don't know when I would have ended up learning about it, but it did introduce these concepts into our culture and lexicon, etc.
All right. That's our
Take a
little
break.
seg. What? Yeah, we'll take
Right?
a break. And I just wanted to plug the movie, I guess, for Hari's sake. It's relatively well done. I think it's worth watching, and it's available for free with ads at truetv.com. Just Google what the problem with Apu's streaming, and you'll be able to find it.
Yeah,
All right.
the app has it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, we'll be back.
Nice.
And we're back.
All right, so we're going to talk about Speedy Gonzales. He came around in 1953, and he was an exaggerated mouse who wore a big sombrero. He had a big handkerchief and this white shirt and white pants, and he ran incredibly fast. And he was kind of like a Robin Hood character. And he would outsmart usually Sylvester or Daffy sometimes, or these gringo characters who are typically greedy or trying to prevent him from, for example, stealing cheese from a factory and giving it to the townspeople. And he definitely had this sort of over-exaggerated, I don't know if you want to call it racist or stereotypical Mexican accent. Andale, andale, Mr. Speedy Gonzales. And
Right.
there's no real argument against people who support this. We'll get more into them later, that it's not exaggerated. No one's saying, like, oh, we actually all sound like this, right? But when you look at the character, ironically, his style of dress, except for the sombrero, is accurate to what a lot of people wore. So not everyone's wearing white shirt, white pants, handkerchief. But when you look at pictures, there's a link on the Wikipedia page. If you follow it, it shows you pictures of people in the early 1900s Mexico. They would typically wear outfits like this. And the sombrero is bigger and exaggerated, but it's a cartoon. That's what you do in cartoons. You exaggerate things. And
Right.
so as they're putting Looney Tunes onto cable and like these cartoons are coming back into the public eye in the 90s, they actually kind of quietly cancel it because they're afraid it's offensive and stereotypical.
Yeah, they phase it out of Cartoon Network.
And eventually, the Cartoon Network makes a sort of statement saying that in light of his offensiveness, we're not going to show Speedy Gonzales anymore. And it no longer reflects our values. I think this was around 2002. And immediately, several Hispanic, Latin American news agencies picked this up, and it was decried. You can look at a 2002 or 2003 New York Times article where they look at comments. Early internet page has like a comment section, and people are typing in the Speedy Gonzales accent and saying like, "Hey, Mr. Gringo, please give us back Speedy. We love him." One guy says that he has Speedy Gonzales hanging on his dash, on his rearview mirror, and so when he's driving, he looks at Speedy Gonzales and takes pride in it, because Speedy Gonzales was not, a bad representation. He stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And the gringos in the show were these greedy people who were trying to take advantage of these humble townsfolk. And so when you're a kid watching Speedy Gonzales, yes, it's a stereotype, and they're making fun of how people speak to a degree. But as Eugenio Derbez, who was going to play him in a movie, which it appears is now shelved, a Mexican actor, he said, well, yeah, I have an accent and I have big ears. Like, I love Speedy Gonzales. I think I want to play him in a movie. We don't want to get rid of him. And so this attempt to cancel him actually backfired, and he came back, and he's been in several things recently. And as I think, who is the I'm blanking on his name right now, Raj.
You gotta give me more than
guy,
that. The what?
The Portlandia guy who played him.
Fred Armisen.
Yeah, so Fred Armisen, who's of mixed heritage, and then a Canadian Filipino actor played him, and now a Mexican actor. Originally, it was Mel Blanc, a white voice actor playing him, but there is also more a progression as character was embraced in Latin America. There's been a conscious movement to more accurately depict him. So instead of paying a white man to do a Mexican accent, finding a Mexican voice actor.
Right. And this is what we mentioned with Apu, right? Representations should improve over time, and it does seem like that's what's happening. Can I read the disclaimer that they put on the Looney Tunes Golden Collection, a DVD box set?
Yeah, you can do whatever you want, Raj.
All right. Well, I think it's actually a pretty prescient statement on the whole thing that's going on, and I think these were released back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. Yeah, they were released from 03 to 08. So this is the disclaimer that they would put on all Looney Tunes cartoons in this DVD collection that they had. The cartoons you're about to see are products of their time. They may depict some of the ethnic and racial prejudices that were commonplace in American society. These depictions were wrong then, and are still wrong today. While the following does not represent the WB view of society, these cartoons are being presented as they were originally created, because to do otherwise would be the same as claiming these prejudices never existed. And I think that's a really important point, right? This idea that if we just sort of cancel stuff and just try to scrub them from our collective memory, then history repeats itself, right? So if we get rid of sort of this progress, like if we get rid of the ability to track the progress that has been made, then I don't know, it just seems dangerous. It seems like things could revert in a way.
Yeah, and if you grow up watching Speedy Gonzales, or watching old Looney Tunes cartoons, Looney cartoons, whatever you want to call them, you're going to kind of be aware that they're outdated. And that, like, if you, especially some of these, like, merry melodies that are horribly offensive, if you're a kid and you watch them and don't see that they're offensive, I don't know, maybe like a 5 or 6 year old wouldn't, but if you're like 8 or 9 and watch these and don't notice that they're offensive or at least question them, the problem isn't the cartoon. It's that your parents or whoever, you haven't been exposed to the history of racism.
Right.
Like, when some of these cartoons, especially back then, there wasn't as much awareness to some of like the more violent aspects, or like that was originally actually the violence in them was decried as long as the racism, hitting each other with mallets, etc. But you'd see some of the episodes and things would get through, and you'd be like, "Huh, that's not okay, right?" Like if that was on Family Guy, my mom would get mad. And if you just get rid of all these cartoons and you have no idea that they ever made racist cartoons, that's just benefiting them as a corporation to a certain degree. Like they did make
Right.
racist cartoons, and there should be knowledge that they existed. And at some point, I don't know what exact age, I think kids should watch them and be like, "Oh, we should be careful not to be too racist," because back then it was pretty bad.
Right. And I think that the Warner Brothers disclaimer there is actually um, a more noble way of dealing with the problem than how corporations are virtue signaling now. Right?
Yeah, and they weren't necessarily trying to fix racism. They were like, "This is going to make us look bad. If we
Right.
have, if we show this cartoon with negative portrayals of, as they saw, a negative portrayal of Mexicans or Mexican Americans, we're going to get a bunch of complaints, and there's going to be a negative article about us." So they're almost trying to preemptively stop themselves from getting this PR hit. Totally backfires, actually. Today, this seems, it seems to be different, where the company, I think companies can't even necessarily do this because this has already happened. I don't know if there's any like super old racist cartoons on TV that people haven't yet questioned. But
Is Boomerang still around? Do you know? That was it's a cable channel. I think you have to give a special subscription or whatever, but it was I mean at this point I was doing that with television, but it was Cartoon Network channel that played their old back catalog of stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if Boomerang has been canceled or
I
that
think
it would
it's
be
still
coming
around to
after
some
pretty
degree.
soon.
It's like when I was a kid, that was a thing. You could like there was a channel that played the old cartoons, but there was
Yeah.
also like a more like public station. Like those cartoons would be on more than like SpongeBob. So if you didn't have cable, it was easier to watch like Looney Tunes than it was SpongeBob. They would put that on at some period during the week, But I know that now, if you're like some of the channels, they're just showing TV from the 90s and early 2000s. So there's so many
Right.
cartoons. So retro TV for kids now is like watching like Hey Arnold, instead of watching like Tom and Jerry was for us.
Tom and Jerry was on all the time.
Yeah, like Tom and Jerry, the Flintstones, Jetsons.
Jetsons, yeah.
Yeah, but those were also like Jetsons. Doesn't have anything really to do with race or ethnicity in the future, but it's a very stereotypical view of the future.
Especially of the time.
Yeah, and they actually almost in a way the Jetsons is super racist because they don't have any other people, right? In the future,
Right. It's a future
white.
of only white people and robots.
That's up. But
uh,
anyway, Speedy Gonzales, this seems to be like a different thing than Apu, and it's almost like I think we touched.
right. I think
Apu.
that's the nice dichotomy that we've picked up in these two, looking at these two characters. Apu is a character that's being criticized by Indian people, right? But Speedy Gonzales, or Apu is an Indian character being criticized by Indian people. Speedy Gonzales is a Mexican character being defended by Mexican people.
He's a mouse being lionized by people.
Yeah, right.
Who are like, we love him. He's a hero to us.
And like the thing that you said about him being a Robin Hood character, that plays into like Mexican history. Like Pancho Villa, the U.S.
Yeah.
government doesn't like him, but he was a Robin Hood character and he was a folk hero. People at the time, lots of people didn't like him because he was he was murdering people and stuff like that. But lots of people also did really regard him as a hero and a savior.
Derbez actually says this. He says we see him almost as another revolucionario, como like Bolivar or who is the other person? He says, it's escaping me right now. Oh, Pancho Villa. He says Bolivar and Pancho Villa as two examples of these, revolutionaries that, he's not obviously a real revolutionary, but you can put him up in that pantheon of like heroes who fought for the poor. And if you're a
Right.
kid, a cartoon about Simon Bolivar fighting imperialists is not necessarily going to get across to you the same way as a little mouse outsmarting a cat and running around in this big goofy hat with his accent and Slowpoke Rodriguez and whatever.
Right.
But you do kind of get this sense of, oh yeah, like steal some cheese and give it to the poor people. Don't own the cheese factory and hoard it all. But then to a degree, like you're saying that to you, Apu is not this offensive thing you want to write a letter to get canceled, right? And
Right.
to a new generation of people, I think that Speedy Gonzales would actually get canceled.
Right.
I don't know if the same thing would apply, and it might be related to like this sort of distance from the real thing. So making fun of a culture of your parents when you're in America versus being in Mexico, and then making kind of the stereotype, you see it in a different way. Like if your parents are being made fun of, and like they're doctors, it affects you in a different way than if your
Yeah, you've
parents
got
are
this
poor.
folk hero type character.
Yeah, I think I don't know if this is not necessarily as complicated as the Apu thing, especially because this cartoon was not very deep. Like he's not a main character throughout the Looney Tunes pantheon, the same way Apu appears over and over again in The Simpsons.
Yeah, it says on the Wikipedia page there's only been 46 cartoons that either star or feature Speedy Gonzales, and there's probably at least like 25 to 30 episodes that are Apu centric in The Simpsons, let alone other episodes where he plays a major role.
And one funny comment I saw too in the New York Times article was something along the lines of like, I constantly hear myself saying like "andale, andale" under my breath, like because like that he had like it was like a catchphrase, and it was like an empowering catchphrase. On the other hand, though, like you told me that your dad had the like computer powering down sound that was
Oh
like
yeah, my back in it was mid 90s or whatever. Dad had a PC, the screensaver thing or whatever. It would also have Apu saying, "Do not touch the Twinkie," and me and my cousins thought it was hilarious, and so did my dad. and, and it's like his brother worked in a convenience store. He has since he was like a high school student, and he still does to this day. Now he owns the convenience store, but like
and to a certain degree, also Apu and Speedy Gonzales both outsmart the white people, like the gringos or the American convenience store customers. Like Apu,
oh yeah,
documentary that he's like this crafty guy who's selling things at a criminal markup. But that's because the people of Springfield are stupid,
right.
and he needs to make money. And as a kid, I definitely saw that. Like it came across like, oh, Homer's so stupid that he'll eat like this hot dog with hair and like rat bites out of it. And it's not necessarily that Apu's people are these like crafty shysters. It's like, oh, he just is taking
He saw an
advantage.
opportunity and he took advantage of it.
Valley of the Blind and One-Eyed Man is king, and like to the same way, Speedy Gonzales is just outsmarting them, and like it's definitely not this thing where like, oh, the white man is this smart, crafty devil. It's like, oh, they're actually kind of like stupid and slovenly and greedy.
Right.
Homer is explicitly slovenly and greedy. He's stealing slushies all the time, and like,
Well, the list of Homer's dysfunctions could take several podcasts to talk about. So,
yeah.
all right. I think we're gonna take another break then, huh?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. Cool. We're back.
All right, so we're mostly going to do a wrap-up section now of the overview of the show and the general idea of cartoon voices and race. But one last example is Diane Nguyen on BoJack Horseman. So she's a Vietnamese American from Boston, and Allison Brie plays the character. And the
Allison Brie is a white woman, just for
yeah,
clarification.
she is a white woman. As far as I know, I haven't seen her 23andMe file, but I think she's completely white. And she seems to be like a she's like an Elizabeth Warren, white level. Like she might be like 99%. Remember, she got those results back.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
She came out and just apologized, and the creator Raphael Bob
Waxberg.
Waxberg, he also apologized. He had a tweet from 2018, and recently he said we should have hired a Vietnamese writer and a Vietnamese actress to play Diane, or if not that, change the character to match who we did hire. And Alison Brie's tweet said that she thinks that people of color should always voice people of color. And so if you look at what Waxberg says, let's say that they wanted to make a Vietnamese character, right? A Vietnamese American character. They thought, like, there's not a Vietnamese character on television. We want to get that idea out there, get them some representation. They can't find an actress who will voice it. Then they just have to change the ethnicity or nationality, right?
Right. This is this is something that we've discussed a little bit, and it's like also goes into the Hank Azaria thing, right? He plays several characters on The Simpsons. Like I think he voices more characters than any of the other voice actors. And can you, especially now, we think of The Simpsons as this great big institution that's been around for 30 years. But when they started out, right, there's a show that starts out like any other show, and would they have had the budget to hire a bunch of people to voice all the different types of characters and to have them be accurately portrayed? No way. So what would end up happening if Hank Azaria is not allowed to do all those voices is you get erasure of people of different backgrounds.
Then, especially the more rare or minority the group, the harder it's going to be to find someone to accurately portray them. So
right.
Another example was the character who's young black Jewish girl, half black, half Jewish, Eric Andre. He's half black, half Jewish. He refers to himself as bluish. I don't know if this fictional character does. I don't know how she refers to herself, but there was a white actress who was playing her, and she said, "I'm not going to do it anymore." So like they're going to have to find if they want to by these rules, it seems that you would have to find a half black, half Jewish woman to play it. That might be hard. I don't know the statistics on Hollywood voice actors and ethnicity. And the argument I think people would make is, well, this is going to give the opportunity for so many more voices to emerge. It doesn't, it doesn't seem like that because you can't get one person. You can't get, hire Aziz Ansari to do Apu and then also do Diane Nguyen. Let's say they have a Vietnamese character on The Simpsons or they do a crossover, right? Because it has to be accurate to each person. It's not just that white people can't do accents, it's that you can't embody a different culture or nationality or ethnicity.
Right. And it does also bring in, like, people have a lot of problems with white people voicing characters of different ethnicities, right? And I can see why that is an issue because of the history of the country. But there's also the flip side of things. There's a character in Bob's Burgers who's voiced by Aziz Ansari. His name is Daryl, and they don't say he's Indian. And as far as I can tell, he's black from his the way he looks. He might be Indian. He's kind of ambiguous, but it really does seem like he's more of a black character. And it's like they don't even address the fact of what his ethnic or race background is. And so it's like, can you even have this ambiguous character in a world with the types of rules, with the rules that are being suggested? Like, then all of a sudden, this character can't just be a kid who's friends with Gene and Louise and Tina. She right in this in Bob's Burgers, it doesn't seem like race is very much an issue at all. They don't have any episodes, as far as I know, which talk about it. So it's like now you have to introduce this element of race and ethnicity and the cultural clashes that come from that in America today into this escapist world. And the cartoons are fantasy too, right? Like BoJack Horseman, he's a half horseman.
Yeah.
How are you going to have someone who like I don't want that to sound dismissive of the critique, but like how do you have a half horseman voiced, right?
Yeah, and it's one of those things that, and you see this in that Pooh documentary when he says to this I think she's English, maybe she's Scottish, don't want to offend anyone, white lady, and he says, "Do you know that Apu's voiced by a white man?" And she goes, "Oh, really? That's kind of offensive, right?" It's like it's not news to anyone that doing an accent and like dressing up is a little like gauche, right? Like not everyone
Right.
will say racist, but it's generally frowned upon. So like it's not that people are largely ignorant of this being an issue, but when you try to make it into a rule and a hard and fast rule, if you follow it to a logical conclusion, it very quickly gets silly. And like specifically with this Daryl character, if you were raised in San Francisco and your parents are from India, or your parents are from Vietnam, or your parents are from Detroit, or any other place in the world, you might sound just like all the other kids who grew up in San Francisco. Maybe you might say some words slightly differently if your parent, or you might have a slight accent you acquired from your parents, but you know what I mean? Like
Right.
Aziz Ansari could sound like a kid who was white or black or Indian who went to, elementary school with the Bob's Burgers kids. There's no reason why people of different races or ethnicities sound a certain way besides culture, right? Where they're from. It's not like genetically X people sound like X. So the
Right.
reason of her racial purity mostly seems to be centered about representation. But do we want to make a hard, fast rule to secure representation for all these groups? And will that actually represent more people? Or will it just go down to, okay, so we might as well keep the cast to several white characters and a black dude and a Hispanic dude. We can't do an Indian dude and we can't do a Thai lady and we can't do a Burmese person. We can't do a Tibetan and Angolan because we can't dig up one of these actors. And so instead of hearing about Angolans, where you might never, come across this country, it's erased from the mainstream culture.
Right. And there's it's not cartoons, but it is related. It's show business. Chris Rock, when I think he was gonna host the Oscars or something like that a few years ago, there was a bunch of controversy over not enough black actors and actresses are
He
being
did end
nominated.
up hosting, and then he kind of riffed on the whole thing, right?
Right, because he said that there's all this there's an issue around, well, in the cultural conversation at the time, people were complaining that there wasn't enough black people being nominated for actors and actress best, like not being nominated for Oscar awards. And Chris Rock says, well, there's one way to guarantee that enough black people get nominated. That is to create a separate award show where black people, where it's exclusively black people. And he's not saying that the Oscars are
Or create
exclusively
a
white people, but it's like, do we really want to get so caught up and bogged down in the race issue that we start segregating ourselves again?
Well, yeah, because I think you made the point too about making a category, so making best black actress category that's best black actress. It might be that there's less black women who win best actress overall, and what does that end up doing? What does that solve any of these issues? No. And like maybe these are things where you can't create rules. You kind of have to rely on people to exercise judgment.
Right.
And
You have to think about stuff, people.
yeah, and like instead of what I see happening right here with this Waxberg person is he's basically removing responsibility. So instead of saying if I want to make a Vietnamese American character, I'm going to learn some stuff. Saying, well, I have to hire a Vietnamese writer. Really, like if you're writing the characters and you hire one writer to do one specific character, you're just giving up your whole artistic creative control and deferring to this person instead of actually learning something and doing it. Like that just seems to be laziness, and like it doesn't actually seem to solve anything. I've kind of messed up because I should have thought more about it and then thinks more about it. Okay, but just saying, well, the solution is to hire someone else to do the work for me.
Right, and having someone working for you in proximity to you doesn't actually translate to learning more about a different type of people or their culture.
No. If he went to, they had an episode where Diane goes to Vietnam, and
Right.
they had the consultant for that episode. This to me makes sense, right? Especially now, if you're writing an episode about a foreign country, you're going to want to get some accuracy going on. You don't want to
If you're writing about a foreign country and none of the writers have been there, that totally makes sense.
By the same token, if going to Vietnam is going to be a common recurring theme in every season, like Diane goes back to Vietnam every year for vacation, then maybe the person who's writing it, the main co-writer, should go to Vietnam and learn about it instead of just being like, well, I will never know.
Right. Or at least pick up a couple of books.
Yeah, read a book. Like, and this is like an excuse for ignorance, which seems to be part of the larger problem. And they keep saying like, "Oh, I was ignorant back then, and now I've learned to defer to authority."
Right. Right.
Congratulations. I'm not proud of you. Where versus like, I don't necessarily agree with this whole cancel Apu thing, but Hari's going out and talking to people, learning things. He tries valiantly to get Hank Azaria on,
Yes.
and like, at least to me, their thing is about improving representation, getting more representation. They're doing stuff. This Bob Waksberg person is specifically to me just seems to be being lazy and being like, I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm going to say what I need to say.
Yeah, I think even in one of the interviews that he does, right, with I think it is with a Vietnamese woman, she asks him a question about the Vietnam episode, and he says, "Before I answer that, how did you feel about the episode?" So he gets her opinion on it, and then I don't want to pass judgment on this guy. I don't know this guy. He might be really sweet, but from a superficial reading done by me of the article, it seems like, oh, he wants to know what this person's answer is so that he can tailor his answer in a certain kind of way to make her comfortable.
Yeah, I'll be the bad cop, Raj. That's my entire impression of him and other people who do things like this. Is that
right?
Cartoon Network, they weren't trying. They didn't one day wake up and say, "Hey, doing a Mexican accent is offensive." They were just found that they were worried that it was going to hurt their wallet, that they would get in trouble. This, I believe he went to Bard, the same college we went to, right, Raj?
Yeah, he's an alum along with us.
How you could go through Bard education. I don't know what it was like when you went there, but not be made at least marginally aware of these issues about race, ethnicity, and representation. I think that he made a specific decision at the time, and what he's doing now is refusing to stand by it because he doesn't want to get in trouble.
Yep.
So he say what he thinks, like you said. He'll wait for someone else to tell him what to say, and then say that. And at the end of the day, that's not fixing anything. He's going to go on to create a show and not have actually learned anything, but have gotten a big old pat on the back. Where somebody who messed up, like, and Hank Azaria did have a chance to defend himself on the documentary. I wish he did want to go on the documentary, but like,
yeah, he should have had a conversation with Hari. I can understand why he wouldn't, because you can attack him for all of his accents, but I do think that it would have been a productive conversation.
Yeah, and like maybe he was afraid that Hari would have been like angry or something, but maybe that's racist. Like, but
yeah, the angry Indian man, a very prominent stereotype.
Well, have you seen those videos of the trains where they have women's only compartments, and then when it gets crowded, men will go on them and crowd them, and then everyone gets slapped around?
As they should.
Well, that's why I've seen it on Reddit, and so it's like justice served. But like multiple people will comment like, this is just, there's like a slapping culture where like if you're breaking the rules, we'll just start smacking you.
Oh yeah, people get smacked all the time in India. You see it in the street all the time.
Azaria is really racist, and he thinks that this is going to happen.
He's worried he'll get smacked by Hari.
But meanwhile, he's just going to be like, "Can you please be on my documentary?"
Right.
Yeah, but anyway, there's different degrees of it, but trying to make the rule, that seems to be where we get into trouble. And I didn't really hear Kalpen or Hari or any of the other people they interviewed. Aziz, different. There's like, I don't know, 14, 15 different people.
Yeah, he interviews quite a few people. It's pretty, like we said, he does make a noble effort in this thing. We don't necessarily agree with everything, but he does put a lot of work into this documentary.
When I look at the other people responding to this, like Alison Brie or Bob Blacksburg, who I don't know what Bob Blacksburg's race is specifically, but the further disconnected from these people that they're supposedly mocking or not paying respect to, they seem to be making these hard, fast rules. So, and maybe I missed it, but I didn't see anyone make this hard, fast rule in a Pooh documentary saying you have to be from India to do an Indian accent on TV.
That's true. No one does say that.
Specifically, Alison Brie comes out and says, "I now understand that people of color should play people of color in cartoons." That seems like, I don't see this helping anyone. The idea that you should be aware, if you're making a show and one of your characters is Vietnamese, don't get like someone to do a super mocking accent that's actually of a Korean person who did your nails before, right?
Well, this is one of the things that we've talked about before, and that's setting up a rule like this essentially says that the other person is so different from me, their experience is so different, that I could not possibly understand what it's like to be them. And it creates this giant gap between people, and I don't think that's helpful. There are differences between people. There's cultural differences, and those things are important. But the idea that that those differences can't be overcome, or that human beings have less in common, um, that human beings have more differences between each other than they have in common. I don't agree with that.
And Aziz makes this point that like it's so hard to imagine people liking a show with four black people. We have shows about purple fish. Like
Right.
imagination, we're limiting our imagination by people saying, "Well, I can't imagine what it's like to be a Vietnamese American, so let me get a Vietnamese American to write it for me." Use
Right.
your imagination, and that act of engaging and walking in someone else's shoes, trying to figure out who they are, what it's like to be them. That actually seems to combat ignorance and racism and these issues that are arising. At the end of the day, we don't want people going around and mocking little Indian kids and saying, "Thank you, come again," right?
Right.
It doesn't have to. I don't think to have that happen, you need to have the only Indian cartoon characters can be played by.
If Apu said the same exact line and it was done by an Indian person, is it really any better?
Yeah, and like people don't even know. Most people seem to not even know what the race of the actor was.
Yeah, most
Um,
people I think assumed he was Indian.
I think I don't know what I thought before. But I think
I
like
don't know what I thought before, but that woman's reaction in the documentary is like, I mean, I never really thought about it, right? As a kid watching The Simpsons, it's like Homer is home. I didn't know it was one person doing all their voices.
yeah, I think as a kid, like that would have been one of those things where you're like, is that racist? You know, like a lot of times too, that old PC idea of race was kind of to not talk about it sometimes, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when it came up that was like, oh, if you heard that the guy doing the Apu accent was racist, is that racist or not? Because people wouldn't talk about things so openly. So you kind of were like on the fence about it.
You mean
Um,
the guy who does the voice is white?
yeah. So no,
Yeah.
finding Hank Azaria, I'm almost positive at some point when I was a kid, I found this out and was like, huh, isn't that a little bit weird? Like, is that racist? Because you do find out when like certain things, like you're reading a book in school, right? The old book from the 50s, and it says something about uh, Indians, and it says Indians, for example, and you
Right,
say, well,
instead of
it's a
Native
book about
Americans.
Indians, and someone will say, hey, well, you're not supposed to say Indians, you're supposed to say Native Americans. You know, it's like 2003, whatever. That's everyone's going to agree that's a PC term to say. Um, you kind of are aware that there are these outdated racist things around, but that also makes you the uncomfortableness to talk about it sometimes does make you question things that aren't racist or aren't as clearly racist. So like I can't think of a specific example, but I was thinking about something that as a kid I thought was racist. It was some like a cartoon character or something, but then it turns out maybe it was Fat Albert. I don't know. There's something like that where I thought it was like a racist cartoon making fun of people, but it turns out it wasn't.
Right.
But because you're a kid and you don't really know these larger forces at play, it's kind of hard to tell. And I don't think it's so ignorant that like most Americans would find like people are that ignorant would they find out and be like, oh, good, I don't want Indians to be hired. You know, like
Right. Right.
um,
I haven't, to be quite frank, I haven't run into too many people like that. And that was, I mean, I don't know what things were like growing up in the 80s and 90s, but I was not really subject to very much racism at all in my life. Um, and you know that I grew up in Washington State, but I don't know. It's it doesn't seem. Yeah, I'll just leave that where it is.
Yeah, and then it does also go back to like relationship between different generations, where like to one generation it was people were kind of told to be more colorblind, right?
Right.
And it was mentioning someone's race too much or bringing it up could be seen as rude and crass. Like there's almost this idea of we ignore it because you don't want it. Race is holding people back. So by ignoring race in the workplace, for example, make people comfortable. If you're the only black person in the office and you constantly have white people coming up and asking you questions about black culture, you know that's obviously, or to us, it kind of seems obviously like crass and rude, and like just completely,
Well,
what's the
it's
word?
like you can talk to me about some other stuff too.
Yeah, but that's almost seems to be coming back with this color consciousness thing, because we're so aware, we're so afraid now that by ignoring race, we're going to ignore the problems that come with race. That the parents are telling kids to pay attention to it again. So, like you know, and early 2000s, it would be more normal to, push kids to see something in a colorblind way. But now that we're getting into an era where color consciousness seems to be in vogue, this might just be the logical consequence of having this desire for a rule. People aren't sure what's going changing, so making a rule is easier to deal with. Am I supposed to be offended by Hank Azaria playing Apu? What's the rule? Let me go to so-and-so's Instagram page. They have the answer. Or let me ask Hari. Where really, I think if something's offensive, you might need to ask some questions, but a white person should be perfectly capable on their own, using Google or library or whatever, figuring out if something's offensive or not without always referring to a person of color. That mentality to me seems to be a problem and kind of very racist.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a proper solution. Although I do understand this impulse for rules. Rules are helpful. They make life simpler. And I think this is kind of a thought on the edge of my mind, right? It's not fleshed out, but something about this desire for rules, especially these PC rules, I think it is related to like manners have kind of gone away. I know that sounds weird and old-fashioned and stuff like that, but people aren't clear on manners, right? Like, yeah, we still have a notion of like you got to say please and thank you, but like there used to be specific rules about manners and etiquette that people would follow, and that made social interactions simpler and easier to grasp. And manners and etiquette, they were, at least in America, they were a product of what we could call white society, right? So there might be like rules and etiquette, and for Indian family might be different than for a white family. But now it seems like manners and etiquette have sort of fallen by the wayside in some way. And I see this desire for rules, specifically when it comes to intercultural and interracial communication, interactions. I think people want to make the interactions more simple, and I totally understand why you would want to do that. I just don't think that these are the right rules to be making.
Well, I think the concept of making rules prevents learning, and I think there has to be these awkward, uncomfortable things sometimes. So two kids on the playground. Let's say you don't know about minstrel shows, right? And you take some charcoal you found or some dirt, and you rub your face and say, "Hey, look, I look like my friend over there, Steve."
That would be really bad.
Yeah, that would be bad. But what do? You make a rule: no kids are allowed to play in the mud anymore. No, you say you use it as a teaching moment, and you take all the kids aside. Say, look, your desire to look like your friend Steve is not wrong, but here's why doing it, relates to this larger phenomenon that was racist in the past. And creating rules like this and teaching kids like these hard rules when they're 3 or 4 or something, that's going to prevent this necessary learning experience of life. And like, there's going to be like new stereotypes that emerge.
Yeah, I agree.
One generation of being like, poor and from the South. Now there might be a stereotype that if you're black, you must be a rapper or a basketball player, right?
Right.
Or that you're a victim, like whatever. The stereotypes are going to update, and like, but specifically to this
right. I don't think that the rules should be made around how to interact with a specific culture or race, but there might be rules around like how to learn about it, right? Because you can't trying to enter into a situation with like the possibility of learning everything about it is impossible. And there are some interactions with strangers on the street where you're just not going to take the time to learn about that person because really there's not enough time in the day. There's not enough years on life. Like you do need to simplify things to a degree.
Yeah, and like in society, but I think we agreed on some level, but I'm just saying these are more like unwritten rules. So like,
yes.
Nothing wrong with having like
you can't write an Emily Post etiquette book about race and cultural relations.
Yeah, but it's perfectly normal, and it's also I think perfectly okay to make like kind of new unspoken norms. Like in the past, there was, people did blackface, and now we're not gonna make a law against blackface. We're not gonna put it in every kid's high school manual. But when it happens, you say, "Oh, you shouldn't do this," and teach kids about it at some point in school. And that's like perfectly normal, like rules for society. Like when you go by people on the street, you might nod at them or something like that. Like, and that helps keep people like, it creates sort of like a general nicety in society. So like there are some rules that you shouldn't you shouldn't walk around and ignore people. You might want to say hi or be friendly. But if you make a law about that, it ends up
Right.
preventing the whole, like, you're not actually learning to do this. You're doing it for the right reasons. And I think that, like, the larger point about the cartoons, I think why Hari and his group of people that he interviewed stopped short of making these hard, fast rules is because they, to some level, they're dealing with it more realistically than someone like Bob Waxberg or Alison Brie. So these are actually, their parents are actually from India and are in some way kind of being made fun of. They want to stop this kind of phenomenon, fix it. And they realize, like, maybe I'm wrong in mischaracterizing, but I think they realize that by making these hard and fast rules, we're kind of not dealing with the real problem, which was that kid who bullied me when I was, 8 years old.
Right. And, a bully kid probably wouldn't want to follow the rules anyway.
And honestly, it's probably more that the kid's parents, the kid who's saying something racist in school, or he probably learned that from his parents. Probably not necessarily a bad kid. And so you're not going to prevent bullies by making TV more accurate or removing these, because people are going to adopt their own stereotypes. People are going to be ignorant.
But yeah, I mean, I guess what we're going to do here is try to figure out and learn about people. Should I go ahead and tease our next episode and our guest?
Yeah, might as well introduce that, talk about it.
Yeah, so next episode, we'll be interviewing DeRoy Murdoch. You got anything to tell us about him before we actually talk to him next week, Ethan?
So initially, Raj and I met. We met DeRoy Murdoch at Bard. I believe, was it 2015, 2016 was the year? He was invited.
That sounds about right. Probably the 2015-2016 school year.
Yeah, so he was invited to Bard to speak at the annual Hana Art Conference, and this was race, sex, and religion, right? That was the theme of the conference. And so there was the panel he was on was about race, and there was 3 African American people, and he was conservative. He's appeared on Fox News. His columns have appeared in New York Post, Boston Herald, Washington Times, National Review, Orange County Register. He's a Fox News contributor. He's been on ABC's Nightline, CNN, MSNBC, PBS. He's a senior fellow with the Atlas Network in Washington and an emeritus media fellow with the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He worked for Senator Orrin Hatch between 1982 and 1985, and then U.S. Senator Pete Wilson. He was a veteran of the 80-84 Reagan campaigns. He's openly gay, and he is joined the board of advisors for the Coalition to Reduce Spending. So he's had a very long career working on all this stuff. We're going to get him to give us more details about himself personally, but I think he definitely falls on the conservative end of the spectrum. We're interested to hear his take on stuff. And when we met him at Bard, the reason why I tried to get him on the show was he just struck us beyond any sort of other qualifications. He was a nice guy. And I was like,
yeah.
This is a nice
He took the time out and talked to us after his own talk, and he had a conversation with a couple of college kids. It's not necessarily true that everyone who talks at a conference will actually take the time to do that. So
yeah, and we're definitely going to get into this later, and he might have had a different take on it, but it did almost seem like people, if you're a conservative in this environment, Bart, it seemed like people are going to give you the side eye, and of all the people at the conference, he's getting this kind of side eye for being conservative. Maybe it's from my perspective, but he was one of the nicest, friendliest people there, and these people who were talking about tolerance and everything were not necessarily so friendly. So that was kind of what made me interested in wanting to talk to DeRoy more. And I end up reading, like, anytime I see an article online, I read Real Clear Politics, where his stuff pops up sometimes. I always read it, because I'm like, regardless of his opinion, I know he's a nice dude, honest fellow.
He's trying to solve problems.
Yeah. And a thoughtful guy. So we're going to be recording an interview with him and get more into that next episode.
Yeah, so stay tuned. All right, guys. Thank you. That's our episode for today.
All right.
came from outer space, but Betty knows I waited, saw the alien, okay. Chalk it up to destiny, the rest meets you like a pretty little rabbit chilling on the moon. I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. The dead endeavor, the happiest rabbit ever within the cosmic blessing of love and energy. Drums to space, you know this is the place. Our heart and soul has saved the human race. Could it be that we truly know the score? 'Cause my alien friends say we ended the war. A bloody battle, an interstellar fight. Somehow we did it, victory of the light. But I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Till the radio and television do tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. The peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign too, okay. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day.